Good morning, class. Welcome back. We do not have good attendance today, but we will continue as always. We're going to work on our critical and analytical reasoning today by using some of the remaining theoretical perspectives on democratization as sort of exercises. I'm going to give you a couple new scenarios that we'll use to think through those theories that we've already introduced. This part of the class at this late date in the semester is largely focused on politics and the development of political institutions, but we're focusing on the political economy of democratization and economic policy. So, as always, we're going to be focusing on those economic and political variables. Our stopping point on Friday was this explainer that I gave you regarding how to respond in a situation where you have weak elites and strong masses. And I told you that in this kind of situation, you don't need to obey. And more importantly, you probably shouldn't because you have the political advantage. The middle classes are stronger than the elites. They are in a better position politically to shape the decision of society, and that is to send the country down a democratic path. And what I mean is the use of that relative class power to facilitate a democratic transition. Anytime there's this conflict, and we're talking about the classes, we refer to this idea of a big family feud or a conflict between the different classes over the shape of the political regime and the future of the country. And so there's always this confrontation. And although this confrontation takes place really outside of constitutional and institutional channels, it still shapes the politics in the future of the country because weaker actors inevitably have to cede the political ground to the strongest side in the conflict. And this is where the expression of power becomes important. And so I explained to you on Friday that since the dictatorship's economic policies favor the elites, affecting a democratic transition will likely increase your wealth and income. And so because you hold the balance of power and because the existing regime primarily serves the elites, you have an opportunity to impose a political regime that would have policies more favorable to you as a worker or a member of the middle class. And I went forward and said to you then, you should protest until and unless the elites regain the upper hand because you have the advantage, you have the upper hand. And so you should act like it and you should use your power to foster or facilitate a democratic transition. But what's interesting is this analysis really raises a lot of questions. And many of you maybe were thinking of some of these already and wondering, well, why is there a conflict? Why exactly, as a worker, am I locked in this struggle or this confrontation with capitalists or landlords? Why do we disagree, supposedly, theoretically? Why are we on opposite sides? And so the questions that I want to pose to you and that we will review a concept in order to talk about and then eventually address with some brainstorming is the concept of policy interests. And the questions that I want to ask are why won't the landowners and capitalists just acquiesce to a democratic transition? Why don't they just allow free elections to take place? Presumably they could avoid any violence or confrontation and they could just acquiesce. Okay. But we also should ask, why are the lower classes in conflict with the landowners and capitalists? Why are they at odds with those elites? What's the reason that they are locked in this conflict or this fight? What's the nature of that conflict? And then, thirdly, relatedly, why won't the working and middle classes just accept autocracy? We asked in the first question, why won't the landowners and capitalists acquiesce? We could also ask, why won't the working and middle classes acquiesce? Why are they against one another? Why are they locked in struggle? And to answer this question, we've got to begin to review a concept from earlier in the semester that you're familiar with, and that concept is policy interests. Policy interests matter a great deal, and we talked about policy interests when we discussed ISI as a development strategy and the development of policy interests around unions and state firms and some of the beneficiaries of the ISI model. We're going to use this concept in a looser but equally focused way in this exercise. And we need to unfurl this and talk about whose interests are involved and what those interests are. And so policy interests are partly the product of a key mechanism, material interests. So these are benefits that derive from an actor's position in the economy. And so as an economic actor, the type of actor you are will determine, what sorts of benefits you might hope for or that might exist for you in the design of the system that result from your position in the economy. If you're a landlord or a capitalist, you have specific benefits that derive from your position in the economy as a landlord or as a capitalist. If you are a worker or a middle class professional, a teacher, you have certain benefits that derive from your position in the economy as a middle class worker or professional. The different actors have different interests, and oftentimes the interests conflict and they come into confrontation and tension, and the actors find themselves in conflict over trying to impose these interests or maintain them or develop them under the status quo or through a change of institutions. In general, policy interests matter a great deal because they motivate the behavior of the actors. It's their interests that lead them to refuse to cede or refuse to acquiesce. It's their interests that drive them to call for or demand free elections. And so then we have to ask a subsequent question, two questions really, in order to fully understand the political economy of this analysis. And those questions are the following. What benefits derive from landowners and capitalists' position in the economy in an autocracy whose economic policies favor them? So, in our hypothetical scenario, a dictatorship whose policies favor the elites, what benefits derive from the elite's position in that political economy? That's the question that we have to answer in order to better understand their political behavior. But we also have to ask the same question about the workers, because the workers are part of this equation too. And after all, the middle classes are the ones who are challenging the elite, the regime. And so we ask, what benefits would derive from workers' position in the economy in a democracy whose policies favor them? The reason we say would derive is because the status quo that we're in is a dictatorship. So it's sort of taken on its face that the workers are disproportionately harmed by those policies in that they're seeking democracy as a way to impose and develop their interests and respond to their interests and create institutions that benefit them. These are the questions that we have to ask. On the one hand, what is the economic position? What are the interests of the capitalists and the landowners? And then what are the potential benefits for workers if we shift to a democracy whose policies are more favorable to them? These are our questions. And what we're going to do is we're now going to do a brainstorming exercise where I open up a document and help us think through this. Now, don't run for the exits. I'm watching the number of participants, so I hope that you'll stay with us. But this is a very useful way for us to start thinking about this question and how these actors differ and why exactly they're locked in such an antagonistic relationship. So allow me to open up a document and then we'll do this together and we can take it step by step and better understand the analysis. Okay, so you should be looking at a document with the text from the slide that I just showed you. And I'd like us to begin with the first bullet point here. What are the benefits or the interests of the landowners and the capitalists in a dictatorship whose policies favor them? What are some of the benefits that derive from their economic position in a situation like that? We'll start slow. Any ideas? Christiana, can you elaborate a little bit? Victor says lower taxes. Good. That's a great start. Christiana, what kinds of distributions though? Can you give us an example? Because all policy is essentially distributive. And so what kinds of policies would favor them, or what certain arrangements would be beneficial for them? Karen, they certainly would be expected to have a higher income under the dictatorship, but what are the sources of that high income? So let's think about some of the benefits or some of the policies that might exist that their interests sort of depend on. And so lower taxes is one example. What else would they want to be lower if they are landowners and capitalists? What else would they want to be lower? Okay, so Alondra suggests they may benefit from multiple exchange rates. Certainly. Let's talk about some others beyond those two. Karina says possibly no market competition. So Karina, I'm going to develop that a little further, and I'm going to suggest that there may be some actors who have monopolies in their sector. That's not uncommon in a dictatorship because, as we've already established, the government and the state are used as a distributive instrument, and in particular to create policies that are very beneficial and disproportionately so to those elites, those upper crust, buttoned up types. Rady says they may receive some kind of protection from the regime. So what kinds of protections? That's definitely possible. Can we think of something a little more concrete? I'll give you this one. How about subsidies? You know, in Argentina, during the dictatorship between 1976 and 1983, there was essentially an uncompetitive business environment that involved using inflation as a tax to transfer wealth to a set of private firms. And this is essentially a form of state-supported or state-assisted capitalism. And other policies that promote state-assisted capitalism. And so this is very distributive, and it's very, very sort of particular or within. It's often a very select group of beneficiaries who the state chooses as beneficiaries of these policies precisely so they can maintain their political support. What about wages? Do landowners and capitalists want wages to be low or high? Rady says they want low wages. Okay. What about the price of food? Do they want the price of food to be low or high? What about food? Do they want the price of food to be low or high? Anybody? So we know they want low wages. What about the price of food and other consumer goods? If we assume that those are produced domestically, or that those mainly are produced by companies who benefit from some of these policies, do they want those prices to be low or high? Karina says they want higher prices for food. Good. What about rents and the cost of housing? Do they want the cost of housing and rent to be low or high?
Professor, why would they want low wages?
Because they don't want to pay their workers so that they can generate larger profits for themselves. What about the cost of rent? Do they want rent and the cost of housing to be low or high?
Low.
Is that right? Let's think through that again. Let's
It should be high. It should be high.
They want it to be high, right? Because they want to generate the largest return on their assets and the land and the housing or the what they own, right? So they want the rents to be higher because very likely they need someone to pay their mortgage, right? So if you live in an apartment and you're paying rent, you're paying someone's mortgage. And so
But
the
then
reason,
wouldn't they also be paying more money for like their cost like of living?
so that has to do with property values. And property values are very complex, but generally speaking, landowners and capitalists want rents to be higher. And so there are other considerations, right? But generally, they'd like to make more rather than less. And so they do want higher prices, higher rents. Okay, good. What about, um, let's see. Victor says, good, good. So there might be more protectionism. And this was a comment that Christiana made as well. And more protectionism favors those domestic companies who compete or theoretically would compete with importers or foreign companies, right? So more protectionism. So they usually have tariffs imposed on imports. That allows domestic firms can raise their prices and they can charge more than they would otherwise. That's another benefit. And it is true that dictatorships, with some exceptions, usually are more protectionist because there are some very powerful domestic firms that don't want to compete with international competition. And so that means, moreover, that not only do they impose tariffs and higher prices, uh, but they also produce lower quality products because they don't have to compete. And so public service delivery or service delivery is also generally more expensive. Quality is usually lower. That works in the favor of the elites because they don't have to make the same investments in utility infrastructure. If, for example, the electric companies are owned by the private companies, what about the cost of tolls on the freeway? Do the landowners and elites want the tolls to be expensive or cheap? They want those tolls to be expensive, right? Because they are generating profit and income from that too. Tolls are more expensive. It's very expensive to take the freeway in Chile because everything is owned by private companies and private actors, and they jack up the prices because they often enjoy monopoly rights and they have little competition, if any. And so people just have to pay through the nose for these services that are often not just expensive, but of lower quality as well. And so there is a lot here, as you can see. You can see then why the elites are clinging to the authoritarian regime. They don't want a transition to democracy if it means turning over the apple cart and giving up some of these benefits. Now, this is really interesting because now we're beginning to peel away the layers and see what takes place under the hood, so to speak. The interests, the material incentives that lead and motivate actors to behave the way they do. Why is there such a competition and a conflict between labor and capital? Well, it's because of this. It's because of these interests in the ways that the interests of landlords and capitalists are in direct tension with those of workers. And we'll deal with that in just a moment. Christiana says weaker unions and weaker worker organizations. Usually, dictatorships involve a repression or a suppression of civil society groups, in especially unions and organizations that advocate for better working conditions and higher wages. And so, as Christiana points out, it's often a political and a question of power relations too. And so, it's not surprising that generally dictatorships do not support labor rights or much civil society organization at all. And so this is often why these confrontations are so antagonistic, and why they're so closely linked to the political economy. Now let's shift our focus. And now I want to focus on, let's say we transition to democracy. Now, what benefits would derive from workers' position in the economy in a democracy whose policies favor them? What kinds of benefits would they potentially derive through the transition to democracy? So Christiana says they would probably gain worker rights, or they'd at least gain an opportunity to promote or advocate for their rights. And they could use democratic institutions to promote that and to advance bills for unions and worker rights, all sorts of stuff, definitely. Alondra says workers would benefit through more worker protections, better healthcare benefits. So Alondra points out that if the dictatorship means that capitalists don't have to provide better wages or benefits, democracy would probably present different incentives for elected leaders who would probably be motivated to push through new protections for large constituencies like workers or middle classes. And so they might pass new laws about social rights, improvement in social and worker rights. Let's talk about some of the concrete, bread and butter issues. What are some of the benefits? Anna says higher wages. Good. That's very, very likely. And there are many reasons why we would expect higher wages. The liberalization of society and the introduction of competitive relationships back into the economy would go a long way, as would the realization of political change, and then that transition, and then the incentives that many parties would have to respond to and represent those large groups of voters, because democracy rewards politicians who build large coalitions. And so unions are also going to be part of this. Workers' rights, unions, as Christiana points out. What else besides higher wages? Probably more job creation, perhaps, if, for example, policies of the government are designed to maybe develop the economy or invest in public works. So we're getting a lot of interesting and good ideas. Let's get back to some of the bread and butter issues before we come to some of these more specific ones. So Alondra says, and I'll come back to some of these other ideas that are coming in, lower rents. That could be achieved in a variety of ways. Democracy presents politicians with incentives to potentially push through rent control or rent caps. Sometimes there are tax abatements to support renters. Sometimes in a democracy, there are powerful incentives to create tax breaks for people who obtain mortgages for new houses. These are all things that might not be available in a dictatorship, because the incentives would be very different. They would motivate and reward leaders who respond mainly to an inner circle and a very narrow group of elites. In a democracy, you have a powerful incentive to try to represent a lot of people. And so lower rents, rent caps, rent control, affordable housing can be achieved in a variety of ways. William says accurately, lower food prices, good. I'm going to go ahead and give you one as well. Cheaper transportation costs, In Argentina, for example, the transition to democracy had an important transportation component. The state is now much more involved in subsidizing the cost of transportation. If you're in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, downtown, you can take a bus for 25 cents and get all the way across the city. In Chile, for example, it's almost $4 to take a metro by comparison. So the state can go a long way in subsidizing transportation to lower the cost for workers and for middle-class people. And that would mean, by the way, a loss for the capitalists, because it would mean lower returns, lower profits, lower benefits, right? And so we're starting to see why this is an economic issue, why democracy is at its core absolutely economic. It has to do with class interests as well as political institutions and political competition. Alondra points out, yes, Christiana, you can elaborate.
What I was gonna say is that, like, in democracy, like under democracy leadership, it also allows workers to move up in jobs rather than remain stagnant, which can lead them to work harder and more efficiently. So it's both beneficial to the business owner and to the worker, because not only will they have more job motivation, but it'll be more efficient for the company.
Totally. So can you elaborate a little bit on where the improvement in upward mobility comes from?
As in, like, maybe I guess you can say like promotions, like, so like being able to move up in jobs, and when you get moved up like in a position, you get higher wages, and it's kind of like a motivation for workers to want to do better and to perform better when they see that there's a chance to move up. So it kind of like goes back to the whole like communism, where like people, like there's no like motivation, because like how like people will pick up their slack, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. So my question for you is, what is it about democracy that makes those promotions more likely? Are there new incentives or different
Yeah,
incentives?
wage.
Wages.
Yes.
Okay, so does democracy reward companies who increase their wages, or do the wages come from the increased power of unions?
Mm,
Both are possible, presumably, right?
yeah.
I mean, it's up to you to
I
think about it. You know, there could be any number of mechanisms.
Right. I feel like it could go either way.
So here's two
Um,
ideas. Let
I'm
me
sorry.
can I give you an idea?
Yes.
So there are at least two things that I can think about. Maybe if unions are stronger and have more representation in boardrooms, promotions become more likely. It's also possible that democratic competition leads politicians and governments to liberalize trade, and that would make the economy more competitive, and then domestic firms would have to increase their their wages and pay workers more in order to attract good talent. And so those are two reasons that democracy could lead to upward mobility, certainly. And I think that there are probably many other mechanisms too. Um, Maybe a new constitution, maybe the stricter enforcement of protections by courts or the judiciary. These are all things that we might associate with democracy. Do you have any other ideas? Anybody else? Christiana? Anyone who wants to comment on what else democracy might do to affect these interests? So we have these polar opposite circumstances, right? On the one hand, a dictatorship that is beneficial to the elites, it's going to mean lower taxes, multiple exchange rates, monopoly power for many companies or families, policies and protections provided by the state through forms of assisted capitalism, lower wages, higher prices for food so that workers have to pay more, higher rents, tariffs on imports so that they can raise their domestic prices, lower quality service delivery, more expensive service delivery, tolls and transportation are more expensive, weaker unions, And then in a democracy, we should expect the opposite, more or less, right? Theoretically, a democracy that's more favorable to workers at a bare minimum should promote workers' rights and unions, improve social and worker rights. It should increase their wages. Theoretically, it should lead to job creation if it changes the incentives faced by companies and they have to respond to the competition from international multinationals. It could and hopefully does lower rents and make more affordable housing, lower food prices, cheaper transportation, upper mobility that might come from better union representation within companies. These are all things that we would associate or potentially expect in a democracy whose policies are more favorable to the workers. And so let's return to the lecture and continue addressing this question of these interests. When I talk about interests in the classes, we're referring to those opposing benefits that we just discussed. Workers and capitalists have opposing interests, and as a result, they become at odds at some point, and the result of the struggle will depend upon their relative class power. They're motivated to clash and to conflict precisely because of their opposing interests. And as we move forward, we'll need to be thinking about these interests because now we're going to think critically using a different model. And I'm going to create a couple new scenarios that involve a similar kind of reasoning and that will invite you to think through the situation in terms of the politics and the economics and the mechanisms and what you expect to happen if you take one course of action versus another. I've given you two approaches to the political economy of democratization, and these are the ones that we know the most about and are the best established. And the second one is the basic economic approach that comes from the Acemoglu and Robinson piece that I had you read for this unit. And what's different about this approach is that it gives the actors a choice. It doesn't assume that they'll take a certain course of action based upon their ability or their structural capacity to shape the outcome. Instead, this approach views the interaction as a set of choices that the actors make and that they make in response to the circumstances at the time. And so the model is very similar in terms of its setup and some of the assumptions that go into it. Basically, the rich are assumed to favor autocracy because of those interests in those policy interests that I just discussed with you a moment ago. The poor, the middle and the working classes, that is most of society, by the way, and that includes probably most of you and I, they want democracy. They favor a transition to democracy in an ideal world. And the actors have a set of choices available to them. So the rich, for example, they can use repression and they can use it to defend the authoritarian regime and sustain autocracy. But it comes at a cost, the use of repression, and they have to measure the cost and benefit of, of repression versus the transition to democracy. Now, they can also choose not to repress then, and that means allow democracy, allow a transition to go forward. On the other hand, the poors, the ordinary working and middle classes, you and I, we may revolt and mobilize in protest, or we may not. And we can choose based upon our assessment of the relative costs and benefits of the choice. And you'll see in a moment that factors on the ground can affect those choices. And the whole point of this exercise and this model is to give actors agency so that we don't predetermine history and anticipate or expect some outcome simply based upon the relative balance of power or the capacities of the different actors. Now, the variable that matters a great deal in this model is the variable of inequality, in the level of inequality. Now, you know that inequality is essentially the extent to which income and wealth are unevenly distributed within a society. And so those societies that are more unequal are closer to 1 on the Gini index, and the ones who are less unequal are closer to 0. And the level of inequality matters a great deal because it conditions the willingness of the rich to use repression to defend and try to sustain the dictatorship. Where inequality is relatively low, the rich are less willing to repress because, all else being equal, the transition to democracy doesn't represent a sizable threat because they don't have a lot of income and wealth that could be redistributed to the masses. It's, all else being equal, not a huge gamble. But if there's a very, very high level of inequality, it's exactly the opposite. The rich really have a lot to lose. There's the good possibility that a transition to democracy will lead to a sizable redistribution of wealth and income away from the rich and towards the masses. And so the level of inequality will condition and affect the choices made by the different actors, the choice to pursue democracy or not, the choice to suppress the uprising or not, and so on. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do some similar scenarios where you think through the possible choices and why you might choose one course of action versus another. Before we do that, let's summarize the predictions of this economic approach, this second approach that I've shown you. We basically have these two variables. Well, we have three variables. We have the landowner capitalist or the elite choice. We have the middle class choice, and then we have the level of inequality. And you notice that the level of inequality will condition and affect the choices made by the different actors. And so, for example, where the level of inequality is quite high, landowners and capitalists are going to be more likely to choose to repress and return to dictatorship, because that high level of inequality means that a transition to democracy would redistribute much of their wealth and income. Under that circumstance, the middle class might be less likely to revolt because they're cognizant of the awareness of the capitalists and landowners of the potential distributional consequences of a transition. We could think of it differently, though. If the level of inequality is lower and the levels are all in all relatively reasonable, the landowners and capitalists are more likely to choose not to repress, and they're more likely to cede to a transition. Of course, it also depends on the choice of the middle class. If the middle class chooses to revolt and the landowners choose to not repress because there are relatively low levels of inequality, a transition becomes likely. But the circumstances could be very different. There could be a high level of inequality, and the landowners could choose to repress, and the middle class may choose to not revolt because of their awareness of the likelihood of a defensive violent response from the state. And so here's a model where the economy and economic development and economic variables matter, but where the choices of the actors are still up in the air. And this is a model that's less deterministic, and it's more useful, for example, if we want to think about the choices available to any given actor in a given circumstance or context. And so here's what we're going to do. Let's do a couple scenarios where I ask you to reason through the situation based on the information that I give you. The first one, dealing with inequality and choice, has to do with mass strategy under circumstances of high inequality. And here is the scenario. You are a worker and activist in a developing country that has high levels of inequality. The country is a dictatorship whose economic policies favor the elites. The working classes have been demanding free elections and recently started organizing large protests. The authorities imposed a state of emergency and jailed protesters. Now, the dilemma arises around the following. Some pro-democratic leaders want to defy the order and plan a revolt. Other leaders want to obey the order and instead not revolt. Your support for one strategy or the other will decide what is done. And so the choice is yours. Should you revolt or not revolt? And why? So the first way I'm going to engage you on this question is by simply launching a poll. And it's just a yes or a no. And I'm asking, should you revolt or not revolt, and why? And in a moment, we'll address the why. But let's first start with just this poll, this question about whether or not you should revolt. Think carefully about the information that I've given you, and think carefully about the model that we're using as a perspective and that we're analyzing in this scenario. Think carefully about the information that I've given you. It's very interesting to see your responses coming in. It's neck and neck right now. Four of you have still yet to come in. It's still close, still close. Okay, all of you have voted. Thank you for participating in that. I'm sharing the results. As you can see, 10 of you, or 59% of you, said revolt. 7 of you, or 41%, said do not revolt. Now, let's hear from anyone who would like to share why you said revolt or not revolt. Any ideas? That's very good, Matt. I want to support you as you reason through this. So as before, I'm going to work with you individually, and then I'll get back with you in a moment. But please respond and tell me a little bit about why you would revolt or not. Already getting some really good responses. One thing that I want to suggest to you is the level of inequality should affect your decision or your choice. You should be taking that piece of information into consideration. You should be thinking about what the political consequences of that level of inequality would be according to this theoretical perspective. And that should be an important consideration for you. Good, Anna. Seeing some excellent reasoning. Continue coming in with your responses. I'm engaging with you as much as possible. And the usefulness of this exercise is that it puts you in a situation where you have to think through a choice and you have to think critically about the potential consequences of the alternatives. And those consequences, as some of you are pointing out, could be sizable and could be significant, in particular based upon the setup, the circumstances that I've given you here. Now, I want to begin to talk about this so that we can address it and not lose the thread. But a few of you are still coming in with responses, and I'm very happy to see this. So here's the deal. In this circumstance, it may be best to not revolt. But hold on. It actually depends. And so if you say it depends, that's good. But there's also a good argument to be made to not revolt. And let me explain to you why. I'll show you why, and we'll use all the tools. And good, Alondra. Okay, so the inequality is quite high. That means that democratization would lead to a very sizable redistribution of wealth and income. So the elites are going to be very likely to repress. They will use the power of the state to repress and to break and to cripple the opposition to the regime, very likely, because the inequality is so high and because they would anticipate such a sizable redistribution if the transition went forward. So this means that revolting will be quite costly. It's likely that blood will be shed and lives will be lost. But here's the thing. If the balance of relative class power favors the workers, it becomes more complicated because politics and the balance of power could mean that the workers in the middle class are strong enough to withstand the repression. Revolting may still be optimal if the workers have the balance of power. The elites do control the state, but there still is the question of relative class power. But there's even another consideration. You could also wait for inequality to fall, right? You could wait for economic development or structural change to occur that results in a natural redistribution of income or at least some change, in which case you might be waiting for a while, but you could bring about a circumstance that would be more conducive to a transition, perhaps if inequality did fall. But then the question becomes, well, what variables affect that? How do you affect the level of inequality if you're choosing to avoid revolution and you're choosing instead to wait it out and wait on what happens in terms of the distribution of wealth and income? Now, these are open questions. We do know what can affect inequality, but the point that I want to make to you is that this model is a little bit less deterministic. There are choices, and the actors need to think carefully about the circumstances and think about the potential consequences based on not just the level of inequality, but also the balance of relative class power. It may be still optimal to go forward with the revolt, depending upon the strength of the masses. Does anyone have a comment or a question about this scenario? So let's do another one. And this time I'm changing only one circumstance and I'm changing the level of inequality. You are a worker and activist in a developing country that has lower levels of inequality. The country is a dictatorship whose economic policies favor the elites. The working classes have been demanding free elections and recently started organizing large protests. The authorities imposed a state of emergency and jailed protesters. Now, the dilemma arises around the following. Some pro-democratic leaders want to defy the order and plan a revolt. Other leaders want to obey the order and instead not revolt. Your support for one strategy or the other will decide what is done. And so the question is the same as before. Under this circumstance, should you revolt or not? And I'm going to launch a new poll so that I can see what you would do in this circumstance. Very interested to see the responses so far. You're much more in agreement on this one. And I think that is a product of the learning that we did just a moment ago. But there's a lot of agreement among you. Virtually everyone has voted. A few people are still out there. I think we can wait another moment just to see the results. If you want to share your reasoning in the chat, that's certainly okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. As you can see, 9 of you who were able to vote in time, or 69% of those who voted, said you should revolt this time. You should revolt. And on the other hand, 4 of you, or 31%, said that you should not. Now, what is the reason that you should revolt in this case? What's the economic or the political economic reason that you should revolt under this circumstance? Does anyone want to share that? So as Karina and Anna have both pointed out, you should revolt because it's lower levels of inequality, and that means the rich are going to be less likely to repress. And why are they less likely to repress if there's lower inequality? Well, it's because the transition to democracy would involve a smaller redistribution of income and wealth, and so it's all in all a lower threat or less of a threat to their economic position. But as you can see, everybody, this has to do with economic interests and the ways in which economic interests and political alignments come together to produce and motivate and guide the behavior of economic actors. So these two models of democratization are really useful for us as a way of analyzing the political economy of transitions. But we will address further issues and have more discussion on Wednesday and Friday. And I'm very happy with your contributions today. Thanks so much for being a part of it, as always. I'm going to go ahead and let you go. We are out of time, but I'll see you on Wednesday.